Hey, John Bell here. Thanks so much for stopping by and checking out my YouTube channel. If you follow the React community around the internet, you've probably seen a lot of hype about hooks. So in this video, we're going to dive into hooks, what they are, how to use them. We're going to start with a class-based stateful component and then refactor that to use hooks with the useState hook. And then we'll also look at replacing lifecycle methods with hooks. So if you haven't had a chance to familiarize yourself with hooks, I highly recommend taking a look at Dan Abramov's talk from ReactConf 2018. His keynote talk was really the introduction that a lot of people had to hooks. Sophie Alpert, Dan Abramov, and Ryan Florence all gave talks at ReactConf 2018. Highly recommend checking out all of those. But in short, hooks are a way that for React developers to use state and other side effects and other React features from function components. So prior to React 16.8, if you wanted to use state in a component, you were required to write a class component. So the problem there, as Dan and others have called out, and the primary motivation for hooks is when you write class-based components, it ends up favoring unfavorable patterns. It ends up creating unfavorable patterns. So you end up with huge components that are hard to refactor and test. There's duplicated logic between different components and lifecycle methods. So oftentimes the logic and anything using state in a component is so tightly coupled to the implementation of that component itself that it's difficult to abstract that logic and create reusable functions that we can litter throughout our app and really consolidate. And then finally, complex patterns emerged like render props and higher order components. And the best way to illustrate this is if you go to a large React site and open up the dev tools, you'll just see a mess of nested components that are there because of render props or when you run into that, it becomes difficult to determine the genesis of a bug or where certain pieces of data may come from. And it also just is hard to debug visually when your component is nested 15 components deep. So hooks provide us an opportunity to flatten out our component structure to create nice reusable chunks of code that even if they use state can be used throughout our application. So what we're going to talk about today are really two of the three basic hooks. So a lot of these other hooks here are really going to be used in conjunction with one of the three or multiple of the three basic hooks. But for all intents and purposes for today, what we're going to be focusing on is useState and useEffect. So useState, as its name implies, allows us to use state in a function component. So what we're going to do is we have this little toggle component here that we have already wired up as a class component. And what we can do is we can console log our state so we can just see this changing when we click the button. So what happens here is we have a class component with a state value of checked, and we've created an onToggle method that when we call onToggle, we'll call setState, and we'll pass a callback to setState with the previous state, and then toggle that value to the opposite of whatever it was when we called onToggle. And then in our render method, we have an input that we output our checked value to, and then we have a toggle button here that is basically the interface between the user and that input and our checked state value. So what we can do is instead of importing a component, we'll import useState from React. We can go ahead and dump all of this here. We don't need a render method because we're going to have a function component, so we're just going to return out of it. And we don't need the onToggle method. So what we'll do is we'll declare our class component, our function component. And then when we use state, useState returns a tuple. So we have an array of, in this case, two values. The first of them is going to be our current state. So here what we can do is we can declare using array destructuring, array assignment destructuring. We can name that value checked, and then we can also call our updater function, which is the second one that we pull out here. We can call that set checked, and then what we'll do is we'll pass our default state to useState. Now, instead, this .state no longer exists, so we just want to reference the checked value that we named here, and we also want to console log that value. And then finally, when we click our toggle button, we want to call our set checked updater function instead of our onToggle method. And what we'll do is we'll just pass the opposite of our checked value into our updater. We can remove this extra brace and then save this, and you can see now we have a working component using state as a function component. So that is the basics of how to refactor a class component to a function component using the state hook. So the next thing is typically in components what you have side effects. So you either need to fetch some data or listen for scroll on the DOM or add a timer or any number of other UI side effects that you may need to deal with. So to that end, the React team has provided us with a hook called useEffect, which replaces the component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount lifecycle methods. So if we want to use this, what we can do is we can create a component and we'll call this one hello. And then in here, we'll use effect. And then in use effect, we'll console log rendered. And then we need to return something from our component. We'll just return the string hello. And then we need to output that component in our app. So now when we give that a save, we just have this hello text. And you can see we have now our rendered text. We'll go ahead and drop our other console log. So now every time this updates, our effect is called. So not necessarily every time our component is re-rendered, but anytime a paint happens, React will call useEffect. That isn't exactly great for performance. So on useEffect, there's a second parameter which you can pass in, which can tell useEffect which values your effect depends on. So if our hello component received props from our app component, we could say we only want this effect to rerun if those props change, not anytime there's a paint, which is much better for performance. So in our case, what we want to do is we want to pass in an empty array. An empty array tells useEffect that we don't depend on any values, but we only want our component to use effect whenever it's mounted or unmounted. There's no value that we care about updating. So we can illustrate this. There's another option here with useEffect where we can return a function out of this. And what we can do is we can console log unmounted. And so what will happen is when our component is unmounted. So for example, if you're attaching to the DOM for something and your component is being unmounted, you want to clean up that DOM listener. There may be other things. If you have a timer, you want to unset it. There may be a lot of other things that you would use typically component will unmount for. So what we can do here is we can return from useEffect our cleanup function. So in this case, what we're going to do is call unmounted. So the best way to illustrate this will be if our checked value is true, we'll render the hello component. If not, we will render null. So that way our component will appear and disappear. So now we get our rendered effect, and now we get our unmounted effect. So we can clean up, we can set things, we can call fetches, we can do just about anything with useEffect. So that's the basics of how to use hooks in React. The gist here is that hooks let you reuse logic between components without having to change that hierarchy, without having to use render props or things like that. They allow you to split one component into a lot of smaller functions that can be shared across multiple components. And they allow you to write React without having to use classes. So if you like this video, please hit the subscribe button below. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next one.